Tonight we're telling a story about a woman who was told she was worthless, a woman who was cast out, broken, and left with nothing. But what the world didn't know is that she was about to give birth to a miracle that would be born from forbidden love, forged in the heart of the desert and defended with blood. But to get that miracle, she would have to survive the man who was sent to destroy her. The canyon walls were like teeth, chewing up the moonlight and spitting out shadows. And in the middle of that rocky jaw, Liz was trapped. Her horse trembled beneath her, its breath pluming in the cold Arizona night. All around them, the blue coats of the cavalry sat on their own horses, rifles glinting like cold, hard promises. And at their head, a man whose face was a mask of pure satisfaction. Judge Hartwell. Well, well, the judge's voice dripped with a greasy sort of triumph. Miss Elizabeth Martinez and her savage lover. He gestured with his chin toward Ayanna, who sat on his horse as still and silent as the stone around them, along with 3 more Apache criminals. This is quite a prize indeed. Liz's blood went from hot with fear to cold with dread. It was over. The escape, the hope, the whispered promises of a new life. It had all led here, to a dead-end canyon and the barrel of a dozen rifles. Judge Hartwell, Liz began, her voice shaking so badly she could barely form the words. I came of my own free will. These men, they haven't committed any crime. Hartwell laughed. It was a sound like rocks grinding together, ugly and without humor. Love, he sneered, spitting the word out like it was poison. Miss Martinez, you've been bewitched by savage magic. No decent white woman could truly love one of these animals. The word hung in the air, sharp and vile, and it lit a fire in Liz, a fire that burned away the fear and left only pure, hot rage. How dare you, she snapped, her voice suddenly clear and strong. Ayanna has shown me more respect, more genuine affection than any man in Copper Ridge ever did. If anyone here is an animal, it's you. You who measure a person's worth by the color of their skin. The judge's face turned a dark, blotchy purple. He looked like he was about to choke on his own fury. He turned to his sergeant, a mountain of a man with a cruel, flat face. Sergeant, he barked, prepare a rope. We'll hang the bucks here and now. An example, the woman. We'll take her back to face justice for her crimes against nature. The sergeant grinned, a terrible, eager sight. He began to uncoil a rope from his saddle. This was it. This was the end. Liz looked at Ayanna, her heart shattering into a million pieces. He met her gaze, and in his dark eyes she saw no fear, only a deep, burning love and a terrible resolve. But just as the sergeant formed the hangman's noose, a new voice cut through the night. It was sharp, clear, and carried an authority that made every man in the canyon freeze. I don't think so, Judge. And from the deepest shadows at the edge of the canyon, a figure stepped into the moonlight, a figure that made Judge Hartwell's jaw drop in disbelief. It was a man they all knew, a man who was supposed to be miles away back in Copper Ridge. It was the town doctor, and he had his own rifle leveled directly at Judge Hartwell's chest. For a second, nobody moved. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. The soldiers looked from their judge to the doctor, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. Dr. Morrison, the quiet, respected man of medicine, who delivered babies and set broken bones. What in God's name was he doing out here? Doctor, Hartwell finally sputtered, his voice a strangled whisper. What is the meaning of this? Are you preventing a lawful lynching? Dr. Morrison's face was calm, but his eyes were like chips of ice. I'm preventing a murder, Judge, he said, his voice steady. I've been following your little posse since you left town. I had a feeling your brand of justice might get out of hand. His gaze flickered to Liz, a brief, almost imperceptible nod. He hadn't been following the posse. He'd been following her, protecting her. Innocent? Hartwell's voice climbed into a shriek. These savages kidnapped a white woman. No one was kidnapped, Dr. Morrison interrupted, his voice cutting through the judge's hysteria. I spoke to Mrs. Gable at the general store, and old man Hemlock down at the livery. They both saw Miss Martinez leave. She packed her own bags. She bought her own horse. She made her own choice, as is her right as a free citizen. The standoff was a taut wire, humming with unspoken violence. Liz could feel it in the air, the moment stretching and stretching until it had to snap. The soldiers were getting nervous, their rifles shifting uncertainly. They were sworn to follow the judge, but the doctor was a man they trusted, a man who had healed their wounds and saved their children. To shoot him would be unthinkable. And then Ayanna did something that changed everything. He moved so slowly, so deliberately, that no one saw it as a threat. He slid from his horse, his hands held open and empty, and he began to walk. He walked directly toward Judge Hartwell, ignoring the dozen rifles that were now trained squarely on his chest. Liz's heart stopped. What was he doing? You want to hang someone for the crime of loving another? Ayanna's voice was quiet, but it carried across the canyon, clear and strong. Then hang me, but let the others go free. Their only crime was friendship. Ayanna, no! Liz cried, but he didn't stop. He walked until he stood directly in front of Hartwell's horse, looking up at the sputtering, furious judge. I am Ayanna of the Chiricahua Apache, he announced, his voice ringing with a formal power that made even the soldiers pause. Son of Chief Nachis, grandson of the great Cochise. A gasp rippled through the soldiers. It was one thing to hang a nameless Apache warrior. It was another thing entirely to lynch the grandson of a legend. Cochise, a name spoken with fear and respect on both sides of the frontier. A name that was known all the way back in Washington. Hartwell's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear finally showing through his rage. He understood the implications. This was no longer a simple matter of frontier justice. This could start a war. You're Cochise's grandson? He stammered. I am, Ayanna confirmed, and I invoke the old laws, the laws your own government has honored in treaties. I claim the right of single combat, champion against champion. The victor determines the fate of all present. Before Hartwell could even process the demand, Dr. Morrison stepped forward again, his rifle never wavering. The judge accepts, he said, his voice firm. Now wait just a minute, Hartwell began. You accept, Dr. Morrison repeated, and there was a note of cold steel in his voice that cut off any further protest. Unless you'd rather explain to a military tribunal why you broke a federal treaty and murdered the grandson of Cochise without due process. I imagine that would be a very short and very unpleasant conversation for you. Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling through the rocks. Hartwell's face was a storm of conflicting emotions. Rage, humiliation, and the dawning, sickening realization that he had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered. Finally, he gave a jerky, reluctant nod. Fine, he snarled through gritted teeth. Single combat. Who is your champion? A slow, dangerous smile spread across Ayanna's face. It was a smile that made several of the soldiers take an involuntary step back. It wasn't a smile of warmth or humor. It was the smile of a predator. I am my own champion, he said softly, as is the Apache way. Now, you choose yours. Hartwell scanned his men, his eyes calculating, searching for the biggest, cruelest weapon he had at his disposal. His gaze finally landed on the mountain of a man who still held the rope. The man with the flat, brutal face and hands like dinner plates. Sergeant Murphy, the judge declared, a hint of his smug confidence returning. Sergeant Murphy will represent justice. And just like that, the world tilted on its axis. Everything, Liz's freedom, Ayanna's life, the future she had barely dared to dream of, now rested on a fight to the death. A fight between the man she loved and a giant who looked like he could break Ayanna in half with one hand. The moon climbed higher, a cold, silent witness in the sky, ready to watch a battle that would decide if love had any chance at all of surviving in a world so determined to crush it. The soldiers cleared a rough circle on the dusty canyon floor. It wasn't an arena of honor. It was a killing ground. The moonlight was harsh, turning the scene into a stark tableau of black and white. On one side stood Sergeant Murphy. He'd stripped off his cavalry jacket, and his bare arms were like tree trunks, roped with thick, brutal muscle. Scars crisscrossed his knuckles, souvenirs from 100 brawls. He was a beast of a man, built by hard labor and honed by frontier violence. He spat on the ground, cracking his massive neck, a low growl rumbling in his chest. On the other side stood Ayana. He removed his buckskin shirt, and in the moonlight, his copper skin seemed to glow. He wasn't built like Murphy. He was lean, coiled, every muscle defined not by bulk, but by function. He moved with the fluid grace of a panther, a creature of speed and lethal precision. Where Murphy was a sledgehammer, Ayana was a razor-edged knife. Liz watched, her hands clenched so tightly her fingernails dug into her palms. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was a nightmare, a primal, terrifying nightmare. Judge Hartwell stepped forward, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The rules are simple, hand to hand, no weapons. The fight ends when one man yields or can no longer continue. The victor's will becomes law for all present. He shot a venomous glare at Dr. Morrison. Dr. Morrison didn't flinch. And if Ayana wins, he stated, making it a declaration, not a question, everyone goes free, unharmed. You gave your word, Judge. Hartwell's jaw tightened. I gave my word. He turned to Running Bear, Ayana's friend, who stood with the other two Apache warriors, their faces like carved stone. And if your man loses, Running Bear asked, his English thick but clear. Then the Apache hang, Hartwell said without a flicker of hesitation, and the woman returns to Copper Ridge to be tried as a traitor to her race. Liz felt sick. The stakes were absolute, life or death, freedom or a fate worse than death. She wanted to scream, to rush forward, to stop this insanity. But she was frozen, trapped in a spectator's horror. Ayana caught her eye from across the circle. He gave her a small, confident smile. It was a look that said, trust me, I am doing this for us. And in that moment, her terror was replaced by a surge of fierce, desperate hope. Begin, Hartwell roared. The fight exploded into motion. Murphy didn't waste a second. He charged forward like a maddened bull, his massive fists swinging in arcs meant to shatter bone. He was counting on overwhelming Ayana immediately, crushing him with sheer size and brute force before the Apache warrior could even think. But it was like trying to punch water. Ayana wasn't there. He flowed around the attacks, weaving and dodging, letting the big man's momentum carry him past. Murphy's fists slammed into empty air, his grunts of effort echoing in the canyon. Ayana's strategy was immediately clear. He wasn't going to trade blows. He couldn't. It would be suicide. Instead, he would be the wasp to Murphy's bear. He darted in and out, a phantom in the moonlight, landing quick, stinging strikes. A jab to the kidneys, a sharp kick to the nerves on the side of a knee, a chop to the brachial plexus in the shoulder. Each blow was precise, calculated to inflict accumulating damage, to drain the big man's stamina while conserving his own. He was dismantling the giant piece by piece, but Sergeant Murphy was more than just a brute. He was a veteran of countless ugly fights. He was cunning. He started to adapt, cutting off Ayana's angles, using his size not just to attack, but to herd. He was shrinking the circle, forcing Ayana into a smaller and smaller space, taking away his greatest advantage, his movement. The first real blow came when Murphy feinted with a right hook and came back with a left that was impossibly fast for a man his size. It caught Ayana on the side of the head, a glancing blow, but with enough force to send him stumbling. The soldiers cheered. For the first time, Ayana looked vulnerable. Before Ayana could recover, Murphy was on him. He didn't try to punch again. He grabbed. His massive hand clamped down on Ayana's arm, his grip like a band of steel. He used his immense strength to spin Ayana around, to lift him off his feet and slam him bodily into the hard rock of the canyon wall. The sound was sickening, a wet, brutal thud that echoed through the silence. Liz screamed, a raw, ragged sound torn from her throat. Ayana crumpled to the ground, a motionless heap at the base of the wall. Dust and pebbles rained down around him. He didn't move. Get up, grandson of Cochise! Running Bear's voice boomed in Apache, a desperate command. Show them the fire that runs in your blood. Murphy stalked forward, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He raised his heavy boot, aiming to bring it down on Ayana's head and end the fight, and Ayana's life in one final brutal stomp. The boot came down, but Ayana wasn't there. With a surge of preternatural speed, he rolled away. Murphy's boots smashed into the rock where his head had been a fraction of a second before, shattering a chunk of stone and sending fragments flying like shrapnel. Ayanna sprang to his feet. Blood trickled from a cut on his temple and from the corner of his mouth, but his eyes were blazing with a terrifying fire. He wiped the blood away with the back of his hand and smiled that same dangerous smile. "Is that all the white man's champion has to offer?" He taunted, his voice low and caring. "My grandmother hits harder." The insult found its mark. Murphy's face flushed with pure animalistic rage. "I'll break you, you filth!" He roared and charged again, all strategy forgotten, his mind clouded by fury. And that was the mistake Ayanna had been waiting for. As Murphy rushed in, Ayanna didn't retreat. He moved forward to meet him. At the last possible second, he dropped low, letting Murphy's momentum carry the big man partially over him. As Murphy passed, Ayanna drove his elbow up and into the sergeant's floating ribs with surgical, devastating force. There was a sharp crack, audible even over the soldier's shouts. Murphy gasped, the air driven from his lungs, his forward charge stopping dead. He staggered, his hand flying to his side, his face a mask of shock and pain. Ayanna didn't give him a moment to recover. He followed up with a whirlwind of strikes. A kick to the back of the knee buckled Murphy's leg. A series of rapid-fire palm-heel strikes to the jaw snapped the big man's head back. A final spinning back fist caught Murphy square on the temple. The giant swayed on his feet, his eyes glazing over. He was still standing, but he was running on fumes. He was done. But just as Ayanna moved in for the finishing blow, Murphy, with a last desperate surge of adrenaline, lunged forward and wrapped his arms around Ayanna's waist. It wasn't a skilled move. It was the desperate grab of a drowning man. He lifted Ayanna clean off the ground, his face contorted with effort and pain, and with a final guttural roar, he heaved Ayanna over his head. Time slowed down. Liz watched in horror as Ayanna hung suspended in the air, framed against the moonlit sky, about to be driven headfirst into the unforgiving rock of the canyon floor. This would be the end. A broken neck. Instant death. But even then, Ayanna was thinking. He was fighting. Instead of struggling against the unbreakable grip, he did the last thing Murphy expected. He went completely limp. For a split second, his dead weight threw Murphy's balance off. It was a tiny opening, a bare fraction of a second, but it was all Ayanna needed. As he began to fall, he twisted his body and drove both of his thumbs hard into the vagus nerve clusters, just behind Murphy's ears. The effect was instantaneous. Murphy's entire nervous system screamed in protest. An involuntary shock spasmed through his body. His grip loosened. Ayanna dropped to the ground behind him, landing on his feet like a cat. Before the dazed sergeant could even process what had happened, Ayanna had his arm wrapped around the big man's throat, sinking in a deep, perfect blood choke. Murphy panicked. He thrashed wildly, his massive arms flailing, but the choke was locked in. He was losing consciousness, his vision starting to tunnel. In a last desperate act, he stumbled backward, trying to crush Ayanna against the canyon wall, to use his own body as a weapon. The impact was brutal. It drove the air from Ayanna's lungs in a sharp gasp, and Liz could see the pain flash across his face. But he held on. He held on with the grim, unyielding determination of a man fighting for everything he loved. "Yield," Ayanna whispered, his voice a strained rasp in Murphy's ear. "Yield and live with honor." For a moment it seemed Murphy would. His struggles were weakening. His face was turning a dusky purple. But pride, or perhaps just sheer stubbornness, made him fight on. With his vision starting to fade to black, he reached back blindly, his hand finding a fistful of Ayanna's long hair. He yanked, using it as leverage to try and flip Ayanna over his shoulder. But Ayanna was prepared. As Murphy pulled, Ayanna used the momentum, planting his foot on the canyon wall and kicking off, twisting his body in midair. The chokehold tightened, and Murphy's desperate move only served to seal his own fate. The big man's eyes rolled back in his head. His body went limp, and he crashed to the ground unconscious. Ayanna released the hold and scrambled away, collapsing onto his hands and knees, gasping for air, his body screaming with pain. The canyon was utterly silent. The soldiers stared, dumbfounded. The Apache warriors watched, their faces grim but proud. Ayana had won. He had faced the giant, endured impossible punishment, and he had won. Judge Hartwell's face was a mask of disbelief and pure, undiluted hatred. This, this changes nothing, he shrieked, his voice cracking. I won't be bound by some savage ritual. I am the law here. He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Ayana. But before he could pull the trigger, Dr. Morrison stepped directly into the line of fire. His own rifle was still pointed at the judge's heart. A deal is a deal, Hartwell, the doctor said, his voice as cold as a grave. You gave your word. As an officer of the court, in front of a dozen witnesses, are you a man of honor, or are you just a liar in a fancy coat? Hartwell looked around at his men. He was searching for support, for someone to back his play, but he found none. The soldiers looked away, their faces showing a mixture of shame and a newfound grudging respect for the Apache warrior who had just defeated their toughest sergeant fair and square. They were soldiers. They understood honor, and they had just witnessed it. Hartwell's hand trembled. He was beaten, humiliated. He slowly, reluctantly, lowered his pistol. Fine, he spat, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Get out of my sight, all of you. But this isn't over. I'll see you hunted down like the animals you are. There's no place in this territory you can hide from me. Liz rushed to Ayana's side, helping him to his feet. He leaned heavily on her, his body bruised and battered, but his spirit unbroken. Let him come, Ayana said, his voice quiet but firm, his eyes locked on Hartwell's. We will be ready. As the cavalry sullenly mounted their horses and prepared to ride away, their defeated sergeant slung over his saddle, Dr. Morrison approached Liz and Ayana. He looked from Ayana's bruised face to Liz's tear-streaked one, and a small, weary smile touched his lips. There's something you should know, Liz, he said, his voice low, about your condition, the reason they cast you out. Liz's heart clenched. She didn't want to think about that now. Not now. I've been studying, the doctor continued, ignoring her pained expression, reading medical journals from back east, from Europe. There are new theories, experimental treatments. It's not just folk tales and old wives' remedies anymore. Your situation, it might not be the life sentence I once believed it to be. Liz stared at him, hardly daring to breathe. Hope was a dangerous thing. She had been crushed by it once before. What are you saying, doctor? He looked at Ayana, then back at her, his eyes full of a strange new light. I'm saying that love might just be the first step in working a miracle, he said, but it sometimes needs a little help from science. And maybe, just maybe, from a faith you've forgotten you had. He then looked north, into the dark, unforgiving wilderness. The journey ahead of you is long, and Hartwell is a vindictive man. He won't give up. But if you can make it to the free territories in Colorado, there are people there who might be able to help. People who understand that the old ways and the new ways can sometimes work together. As the last of the hoofbeats faded into the night, Liz held on to Ayana, the pain of his injuries a real and solid thing under her hands. They had won. They were alive and free, but Hartwell's threat echoed in the silent canyon. They had survived the battle, but the war for their future had just begun. And now the doctor had given her a tiny, terrifying spark of a new kind of hope. A hope that was perhaps even more impossible than surviving a fight to the death. The hope of a family. The journey north was a special kind of hell. They traveled only under the cloak of darkness. The moon their only guide. The stars their only witnesses. Every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. Every distant coyote howl sounded like the baying of Hartwell's hounds. During the day, they would hide in caves, abandoned line shacks, or dense thickets, sleeping in shifts, never truly resting. Running Bear and the other two warriors, Silent Fox and Little Hawk, were ghosts in the wilderness. They scouted ahead, silent and unseen, ensuring the path was clear of cavalry patrols. But the cavalry wasn't their only fear. They were crossing through lands that were a patchwork of contested territories. Not every Apache band was friendly. Ayana had broken a serious taboo by choosing a white woman, and there were traditionalists who would see his actions as a betrayal, an omen of bad medicine. One night, as they were making their way through a narrow pass, Silent Fox came gliding back through the darkness, his face grim. "Riders," he whispered in Apache, "not soldiers. Mescalero, and they fly the red paint of war." A cold dread settled over Liz. Mescalero Apache, a rival band, known for their fierceness and their adherence to the old ways. They wouldn't care about Cochisi's legacy. They would only see an enemy with a white captive. "How many?" Ayana asked, his hand instantly going to the knife at his belt. "5, maybe 6. They're tracking us. They found our trail back at the river," Silent Fox reported. "They were caught between a rock and a hard place. Ahead, the unknown dangers of the trail to Colorado. Behind, Hartwell's relentless pursuit. And now, closing in on their flank, a war party that wanted them dead for entirely different reasons. There was no going back, and going forward was a death sentence." "We cannot outrun them," Running Bear said, his voice a low rumble. "And we cannot fight them, not without making enough noise to bring the soldiers down on us." Liz's mind raced. They needed a diversion, something clever. She thought back to the stories her grandfather used to tell, tales of the frontier, of trickery and survival. "The horses," she said suddenly. The men looked at her. "They're horses. If they have no horses, they cannot follow." A slow smile spread across Ayana's face. He understood immediately. It was a crazy risk, but it was their only chance. He and Silent Fox would double back. Under the cover of the new moon, they would sneak into the Mescalero camp and steal their mounts, scattering them to the four winds. It was an act of incredible audacity. If they were caught, they would face a slow, agonizing death. Liz and the others could only wait, huddled in a small rocky crevice, listening to the sounds of the night. Every minute stretched into an eternity. The waiting was a torment worse than any physical hardship they had endured. Liz prayed. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. Her hands clenched around the small wooden cross her mother had given her. Hours passed. The sky began to lighten in the east, the first hint of a dawn that could expose them all. And then, just as despair began to set in, two figures emerged from the shadows like smoke. It was Ayana and Silent Fox. They were empty-handed, but they were alive. "It is done," Ayana whispered, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "They will be walking for a week." They pushed on, their pace frantic, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate need to put as much distance as possible between them and their pursuers. They crossed the border into Colorado territory, weak, starving, and on the verge of collapse. The landscape began to change, the harsh desert giving way to pine-clad mountains and green valleys. It was a land that promised sanctuary, a new beginning. They found the settlement Dr. Morrison had told them about, tucked away in a high mountain valley. It was called Havens Creek, and at first glance it lived up to its name. There were log cabins, a small general store, and fields where crops grew green and strong. And most surprisingly, there were white settlers and Apache families living side by side. Not in perfect harmony, perhaps, but in a state of weary practical peace. Their arrival, however, was not met with open arms. They were outsiders, strangers who brought the stink of trouble with them. The leader of the settlement, a former cavalry captain named James Mackenzie, listened to their story with a grim, unreadable expression. He was a man who had seen too much violence, and his eyes were wary. "You bring a feud with you," Mackenzie said, his voice flat. "Judge Hartwell is a territorial judge. His reach is long, and his memory is even longer. We have built a fragile peace here. I will not have it shattered. We ask only for a place to live," Ayana said, "a chance to build a life. We will not cause trouble." Mackenzie looked at Liz, his gaze softening slightly as he saw the exhaustion and desperation etched on her face. "You can stay," he said finally, making a decision that was clearly against his better judgment. "There's an old abandoned cabin at the far end of the valley. You can have it, but you are on probation. One hint of trouble, one sign that Hartwell is coming, and you are gone. Do you understand?" They understood. The cabin was little more than a ruin. The roof leaked, the walls were full of holes, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the logs. But it was theirs. It was a start. They worked day and night to make it habitable. Ayana, using skills he had learned as a boy, repaired the walls with a mixture of mud and grass. Liz, using the small amount of money she had saved, bought what little they could afford from the general store: flour, salt, a few tools. Life was hard. Some of the white settlers eyed them with suspicion, muttering behind their hands when Liz came to the store. Some of the Apache families kept their distance, unsure of the woman who had lured one of their own away from his people. But slowly, painstakingly, they began to build a life. Ayana proved to be a skilled hunter, providing them with meat. Liz started a small garden, her hands, once soft, now calloused and stained with earth. Dr. Morrison arrived a few months later, as he had promised. He came with his medical books, his strange instruments, and a quiet determination. He began the treatments he had spoken of. They were a strange and often frightening mix of his modern science and the ancient herbal knowledge of the Apache. He would consult with a local Apache medicine woman, a wise, wizened old woman named White Dove, who also happened to be Ayana's great aunt. The two of them would argue for hours, the doctor with his Latin terms and scientific charts, the old woman with her bundles of herbs and spiritual chants. But together they created a regimen for Liz. It involved foul-tasting teas, painful acupuncture-like procedures using sharpened yucca spines, and strange meditative ceremonies that were meant to heal her spirit as well as her body. Weeks turned into months. The seasons changed. The harsh mountain winter gave way to a brief, beautiful spring, and nothing happened. Liz's hope began to wither. The daily ritual of teas and treatments started to feel like a fool's errand. The dream that had been sparked in the canyon began to flicker and die. She was broken. She had been told she was broken, and it was true. She had dragged Ayana away from his home, into a hard and uncertain life, for a dream that could never be. The guilt began to eat at her, a quiet poison in her soul. One morning she couldn't face it anymore. She refused the tea White Dove offered her. "It's no use," she said, her voice hollow. "I'm sorry. I'm just empty." White Dove looked at her, her dark ancient eyes full of a wisdom that seemed to stretch back for centuries. She didn't argue. She simply placed a gnarled hand on Liz's abdomen. "The spirits of unborn children choose their parents carefully," the old woman said softly. "They look for a heart that is strong enough, a heart that has been tested by fire and proven true. They do not come to a home that is filled with despair. You must make your heart a welcoming place, little bird. Only then will they choose to nest." The words, so simple and yet so profound, broke through Liz's wall of despair. She wept. She wept for the life she had lost, for the pain she had endured, and for the hope she had been so close to abandoning. Ayana held her, his quiet strength a shield around her. She started the treatments again the next day, but this time it was different. She drank the teas not as a medicine, but as an invitation. She endured the procedures not as a cure, but as a preparation. She was making her heart a welcoming place. And a month later, the world shifted. It started with a morning sickness that she mistook for a stomach ailment, then a weariness in her bones that she attributed to the hard work of the garden. But when a full moon passed, and then another, a wild, impossible thought began to take root in her mind. She told no one, afraid to even speak it aloud, afraid the slightest breath would shatter the fragile possibility. Finally, she went to Dr. Morrison. He examined her, his face a mask of professional concentration. He listened with his stethoscope, his brow furrowed. He pressed gently on her abdomen. The silence in the small examination room was absolute. Liz felt her heart hammering against her ribs, so loud she was sure he could hear it. He finally looked up, his eyes wide with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. Was it pity? Disappointment? "Well, Liz," he said, his voice sounding strangely hoarse, "there is definitely a heartbeat." Tears of joy sprang to Liz's eyes. A heartbeat, a baby, their baby. It had worked. The miracle had happened. "Oh, doctor," she breathed, laughing through her tears. "Thank you." But the doctor wasn't smiling. He was still listening, his expression one of intense, almost fearful concentration. He moved the stethoscope, listened again, and then again. His face had gone pale. "Doctor?" Liz asked, her own joy turning to a cold knot of fear. What is it? Is something wrong? Dr. Morrison slowly took the stethoscope from his ears. He looked at her, his eyes full of a kind of terrified wonder. Liz, he said, his voice barely a whisper, there isn't a heartbeat. He paused, taking a deep, shaky breath. There are 3. Triplets. The word echoed in the small cabin, a sound both miraculous and terrifying. 3 heartbeats. 3 tiny lives growing inside the woman everyone had dismissed as barren. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost overwhelming. The outcast, the worthless woman, was now carrying a bounty so great it seemed impossible. The pregnancy was a trial by fire. Dr. Morrison, for all his modern knowledge, was in uncharted territory. Carrying triplets was dangerous for any woman. For Liz, with her history, it was a razor's edge. He warned them of the risks: premature labor, dangerously high blood pressure, the sheer physical strain on her body. White Dove, however, was unperturbed. She saw it not as a medical crisis, but as a spiritual blessing of immense power. The spirits do not give a gift that cannot be carried, she would say, brewing her strange, earthy-smelling teas. Your body is strong. Your heart is stronger. The 2 healers continued their strange partnership, a fusion of ancient wisdom and modern science. Dr. Morrison monitored Liz's health with his instruments, while White Dove tended to her spirit with herbs and chants. Iana was a rock. He took over all the hard labor, tending the garden, hunting, reinforcing the cabin for the coming winter. He would spend hours just sitting with Liz, his hand resting on her swollen belly, his face a mixture of awe and fierce, protective love. He would talk to his unborn children in the low, soft cadences of the Apache language, telling them stories of their people, of the great chiefs, of the sacred mountains. As Liz grew larger, the reality of their situation began to set in. 3 babies. How would they manage? Their small cabin was barely big enough for 2. Their resources were meager. Fear, a cold and practical companion, began to creep back into Liz's heart. But the community of Havens Creek, the same community that had once viewed them with such suspicion, began to rally around them. It started small. A neighbor, Mrs. Mackenzie, the captain's wife, brought over a basket of vegetables from her garden. Then, one of the Apache women left a bundle of soft, tanned deerskins on their doorstep, perfect for swaddling clothes. Soon others followed. The settlers, many of whom had faced their own hardships on the frontier, understood the struggle of starting a family with nothing. The Apache, who valued community and kinship above all else, saw a family in need. The men from the town, led by Captain Mackenzie himself, showed up one Saturday and, in a single day of sweat and sawdust, built a new room onto their cabin. Liz was overwhelmed. The kindness of these people who had every reason to distrust her and her husband, was a powerful antidote to the years of rejection she had suffered in Copper Ridge. They weren't just building a room, they were building a home. They were accepting her and Ayanna and their unborn children into the fragile peace of Havens Creek. The babies grew, and Liz's body was pushed to its absolute limit. She was constantly exhausted, her back ached, and she could barely move from her bed in the final weeks. And then one cold autumn night, with the first snows of winter dusting the mountain peaks, the pains began. They were sharp, intense, and came far too close together. It was too early. Dr. Morrison had warned them about this. He had said the greatest danger was a premature birth. Ayanna's face was a mask of calm, but Liz could see the fear in his eyes. He ran to get the doctor and White Dove. Within minutes, their small cabin was transformed into a makeshift delivery room. Dr. Morrison arrived with his black medical bag, his professional demeanor a thin veil over his own anxiety. White Dove came with her herbs and sacred items, her ancient face serene as she began to burn sage, its pungent smoke filling the room. It's early, Dr. Morrison confirmed after a quick examination, his voice tight. But not dangerously so. The babies are small, but they seem strong. Their positioning is, well, it's crowded in there. But we can do this, Liz. You can do this. The labor was a long, brutal war. Hours bled into one another, a blur of unimaginable pain and gritted teeth determination. Ayana never left her side. He held her hand, wiped the sweat from her brow, and whispered words of love and encouragement, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of pain. White Dove chanted, her voice rising and falling in an ancient rhythm that seemed to connect the small, struggling cabin to the vast, silent wilderness outside. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered mountains in hues of pink and orange, Dr. Morrison's voice cut through the haze of pain. "The first one is coming. I can see the head. Push, Liz. One more good push." With a final, monumental effort, a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed, the first baby came into the world. Its cry was thin but lusty, a defiant shout that filled the cabin with the most beautiful sound Liz had ever heard. "A son," Dr. Morrison announced, his voice thick with emotion as he laid the tiny, squalling infant on Liz's chest. A perfect, healthy son. Tears streamed down Liz's face, mingling with the sweat. She looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face of her firstborn. He had Ayana's shock of dark hair and his strong, proud features. But when he opened his eyes, they were her own honey-colored eyes, staring back at her with a startling, ancient wisdom. "Little Wolf," Ayana whispered, giving him his Apache name. Strong and brave, like his mother. But there was no time to rest, no time to savor the moment. The second baby was coming. The pains returned with a vengeance. 20 minutes later, after another fierce struggle, the second child was born. "Another son," the doctor declared, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. This baby was bigger than the first, his cry louder, more demanding. He was a perfect blend of both of them, and when Ayana offered him a finger, the baby's tiny hand gripped it with surprising strength. "Running bear," Ayana said, his voice cracking with emotion as he honored the friend who had risked everything to help them escape. May he be as strong and loyal as his namesake. 2 sons, 2 miracles. Liz felt a wave of relief and joy so powerful it almost swept her away. They had done it, but the ordeal wasn't over. There was still one more, and the third birth was the hardest. The baby was positioned awkwardly, and Liz was nearing the end of her strength. Dr. Morrison's face grew tense, his usual calm replaced by a deep, worried frown as he worked to guide the final child into the world. "Come on, little one," he murmured, his forehead beaded with sweat. "Don't you give up on us now." White Dove's chanting grew louder, more urgent, her voice pleading with the spirits to guide this last struggling soul safely into the world. Liz gathered every last ounce of her remaining strength. She knew with a primal certainty that this final effort would be the one that mattered most. She pushed, a raw, desperate scream tearing from her throat, a push that felt like it was tearing her very soul from her body. And then, silence. The third baby emerged. But unlike its brothers, this child did not cry. It was small, frighteningly still, and its skin had a pale bluish tint. The joyous atmosphere in the cabin evaporated, replaced by a sudden, suffocating terror. "It's not breathing," Dr. Morrison said, his voice sharp with urgency. He took the baby, clearing its airways, rubbing its tiny chest, trying to stimulate a breath. But there was nothing. The room held its breath, a collective, silent prayer. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Ayana knelt by the bed, his face ashen. White Dove's chanting stopped. And in that terrible, silent moment, Liz felt a despair deeper than any she had ever known. To have come so far, to have been given so much, only to have it snatched away at the very end. It was a cruelty beyond measure. Then Dr. Morrison did something strange. He looked at White Dove. In his eyes was a silent admission of defeat. He had done all that his science knew how to do. The old medicine woman nodded once, a deep understanding passing between them. She took the still, silent baby from his hands. She held the infant up, chanting not to the spirits of the sky, but directly into the child's face. Her ancient words a soft, urgent whisper. And then she did something that made Liz's heart stop. She placed her mouth over the baby's mouth and nose and breathed her own breath, her own life force, into its tiny, still lungs. Once, twice, and then a tiny sputtering cough, a gasp. And then, like the first ray of sunlight after a long and terrible storm, A thin, reedy wail pierced the silence. The third baby, a daughter, smaller and more fragile than her brothers, but fiercely, tenaciously alive, announced her arrival. Ayana laughed, a raw, broken sound that was half sob, half cheer. He took his daughter, cradling her as if she were made of spun glass. "Golden eyes," he whispered, tears streaming freely down his face, "for the color that marks her as her mother's child, and for the fighting spirit that will let no one defeat her." As night fell, Liz lay in her bed, a sleeping son tucked into the crook of each arm, her tiny, miraculous daughter nestled on her chest. Ayana sat beside her, a silent, tireless guardian. The outcast, the barren woman, was now the mother of nations. She had her family. She had her miracle. 3 times over. It was a perfect moment, a hard-won peace. But peace on the frontier is a fragile thing, and men like Judge Hartwell do not forget. They do not forgive. And hundreds of miles away, in a dusty office in Arizona, a man was nursing a grudge. A grudge that had festered for 2 long years into a dark and obsessive hatred. And he was planning his revenge. The battle for their survival was over. But the war for their future was about to come to their doorstep. The years that followed were a fragile, precious peace. Havens Creek became their home in a way Copper Ridge never could have been. Little Wolf, Running Bear, and Golden Eyes grew strong and wild in the mountain air. They were a beautiful, chaotic blend of 2 worlds. They had their father's resilience and knowledge of the wild, and their mother's stubborn determination and honey-colored eyes. They were living proof that love could bridge any divide. Ayana became a respected member of the community, a bridge between the settlers and the Apache. His wisdom and skill as a hunter were valued by all. Liz found her place too. The woman who had been shamed for her barrenness became a source of strength and comfort for the other women in the settlement, her own hard-won miracle a quiet testament to hope. But Liz never forgot Hartwell's threat. It was a shadow at the edge of her happiness, a cold whisper on the wind. She would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, her heart pounding, convinced she heard the sound of approaching horses. Ayana would hold her, his presence a warm, solid comfort in the darkness. But even he could not entirely banish the fear. They knew Hartwell was a patient man, and his hatred was a poison that would not dilute with time. The blow fell on a warm summer evening, 5 years after they had arrived in Havens Creek. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter echoing in the twilight. Liz was inside preparing dinner, the familiar, comforting smells of stew and fresh bread filling the cabin. Ayana was chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady heartbeat in the quiet valley. It started with the dogs. Every dog in the settlement suddenly began to bark, a frantic, furious chorus of alarm. Ayana stopped chopping, his head lifting, his body instantly alert. He scanned the tree line at the edge of the valley, and then he saw them, riders, a dozen of them emerging from the woods. They weren't soldiers. There were no blue uniforms, no regimental flags. These were hard men, their faces grim, their clothes dusty from a long ride. They carried rifles, and they moved with a grim, predatory purpose. And at their head, a man Liz recognized even from this distance. A man who had haunted her nightmares for 5 years. Judge Hartwell. He looked older, his face leaner and etched with deeper lines of bitterness, but his eyes, even from afar, burned with the same obsessive hatred. "Liz!" Ayana's voice was sharp, a commander's bark. "Get the children inside. Bar the door." Liz didn't hesitate. She scooped up Golden Eyes and herded the 2 boys into the cabin, her heart a block of ice in her chest. She slammed the heavy wooden bar across the door just as the riders reached their small plot of land. Through the small window, she watched as Ayana stood his ground, the axe held loosely in his hand. He didn't look afraid. He looked weary, like a man facing an old, inevitable enemy. "Hartwell," Ayana called out, his voice steady. "You have no authority here. This is Colorado territory. You are nothing more than a trespasser." Hartwell laughed, that same ugly, grinding sound she remembered from the canyon. "I am not here as a judge, savage," he sneered. "The law was too slow, too unsatisfying. I am here as a private citizen, seeking restitution for a crime committed against my family." Liz frowned. His family? What was he talking about? "You have no quarrel with my family," Ayanna said. Oh, but I do, Hartwell replied, his eyes glittering with a strange, manic light. He gestured toward Liz, a spectral figure visible through the window. That woman, she was promised to my nephew. A good, decent man. Tom Bradley. You remember him, don't you, Miss Martinez? Liz felt the blood drain from her face. Tom Bradley, the cruel, weak man from Copper Ridge, who had offered her a life of shame. Hartwell was his uncle. This wasn't just about racial hatred or wounded pride. This was personal. This was a family vendetta. She chose a different life, Ayanna said, his grip tightening on the axe handle. She chose to defile herself with you. Hartwell shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. She brought shame upon my family name. And you will pay for it. All of you. He raised his hand. Burn it, he commanded his men. Burn it all to the ground. One of the riders dismounted, a lit torch in his hand. He started walking toward the cabin. This was it. The end of their peace. The end of everything. But just as the man with the torch reached the edge of the garden, a rifle shot cracked through the evening air. The torch flew from his hand as he yelped in pain, clutching a shattered wrist. The shot hadn't come from Ayanna. It had come from the next cabin down the valley. Hartwell and his men spun around and saw they were no longer alone. From the other cabins, men were emerging, white settlers and Apache warriors, standing side by side. Captain Mackenzie stood on the porch of the general store, a big buffalo rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Dr. Morrison was there, his face grim, a shotgun in his hands. Even White Dove stood on her porch, holding an ancient long-barreled rifle with the ease of a seasoned warrior. The entire community of Havens Creek had come out to stand with them. This is not your land, Hartwell, Captain Mackenzie's voice boomed across the valley, and these are not your people to terrorize. These are our neighbors. You have a problem with them, you have a problem with all of us. Hartwell stared, his face a mask of disbelief. He had expected to find an isolated family, easy prey. He had not expected this. An entire town united against him. His hired guns looked at each other, their confidence suddenly wavering. They had been paid to burn out a single homesteader, not to fight a small army. This is not your fight, Mackenzie, Hartwell screamed, his voice strained. This is a matter of family honor. We are all family here, Mackenzie replied, his voice cold as iron. Now I suggest you and your trash get back on your horses and ride out of this valley, and don't ever come back. For a long moment, the two groups faced each other in a tense standoff. Liz watched, her breath caught in her throat, as her three small children huddled behind her. She was watching the two halves of her world, the hatred she had fled and the acceptance she had found, facing off in a final confrontation. Hartwell's face was a terrible sight. It was the face of a man whose entire worldview was crumbling around him. The face of a man consumed by a hatred so powerful that it had finally destroyed him. He looked at Ayanna, then at the united front of the town, and something inside him seemed to snap. With a wild, incoherent scream of pure rage, he spurred his horse forward, drawing his pistol, aiming not at Ayanna, but at the cabin window where he knew Liz and the children were watching. He never fired the shot. Two rifles cracked at the exact same moment, one from Captain Mackenzie, one from Ayanna's old friend, Running Bear, who had settled in the valley a year prior. Hartwell was thrown from his saddle, a look of shocked surprise on his face, and fell to the dust of the valley floor. He lay still. His hired guns stared for a moment at their fallen leader, then looked at the line of determined faces and raised rifles. Without a word, they turned their horses and fled, melting back into the woods, leaving the body of the man who had hired them behind. Silence descended on the valley, broken only by the whimpering of the children in the cabin. Liz slowly unbarred the door and stepped outside. She looked at Ayanna. She looked at her neighbors, these people from two different worlds who had come together to defend her family. Her home. Ayanna came to her, wrapping his arms around her and their children as they came running out of the cabin. Dr. Morrison walked over and stood beside them, placing a hand on Little Wolf's shoulder. Captain Mackenzie gave a solemn nod. The shadow was gone. The long night of fear was finally over. The hatred that had chased them across the desert had been met here, in this valley, and it had been defeated. Not by a single champion in a moonlit canyon, but by a community. By the simple, powerful act of people choosing to stand together. Looking at the faces of her children, their heritage from two peoples, written so clearly on their beautiful features, Liz finally understood. The miracle wasn't just that she had been able to have children. The miracle was this place, this life, this proof that even in a world full of hatred and division, a better way was possible. Their love hadn't just created a family, it had helped build a future. So let me ask you a question. When Liz was told her dream was impossible, that she was broken and worthless, should she have believed it? When the world tried to tear her and Ayana apart, should they have given up and accepted the hate? Because the thing that haunts me about this story is how often we let the world tell us what's possible. We let it tell us who we can love, what we can achieve, what we are worth. Liz and Ayana refused to listen. They fought, they bled, and they built a life that was more beautiful than anything they could have imagined. Their story proves that the greatest miracles aren't the ones that fall from the sky. They're the ones we build with our own two hands, with courage, with stubbornness, and with a love that refuses to be broken. If you believe that our own limitations are the only ones that truly matter, if you believe that love is always worth fighting for, then I need you to subscribe to this channel right now, because I'm going to keep bringing you stories about people who looked at an impossible world and decided to build a better one. Stories that will remind you that your own miracles are out there, waiting for you to be brave enough to fight for them. The only question is, are you ready?